Welcome to EDU Pod 7. I'm joined by my grandfather, John Bazalgette. Would you like to quickly introduce yourself?
Hello, I'm Frank's grandfather, which is a great privilege for me, and I'm looking forward to whatever it is he's going to do to me now.
Could you quickly go over a little bit of your background in education and
Yes.
your story?
I've got a rather unusual history as far as going to schools. I've been to at least 6 different schools. Most people have been to 2 or possibly 3, but I've been in 6. My first school was Neemuch Railway School when I was 5 years old in India, where all my contemporaries would have been being trained ultimately to be working on the Indian railways. After that, I went to a school in the Himalayas. Then I left there and went to two different schools in Venezuela, and finally went to an English public boarding school, which was the worst shock of my life.
And after you left the education system, what about in your adult life?
Well, I went to university, and after I went to university, I decided I would do some teaching. In those days, if you were a graduate, you could, and were alive and stood up and reasonably warm, then you could go and teach. You didn't need to be trained. It was assumed you had everything you needed. And I taught for 5 years in the first comprehensive school in Hertfordshire, which is part of England, in which I discovered the fascination of the children from a whole community all going to the same school. I had the daughter of a bank manager sitting in my class, sitting next to the son of a shepherd, and you've got everything in between in all of that. But what I discovered then was that I was fascinated in terms of the influence of the institution and its arrangements and the way authority and power are used in the school in order to help young people, adults, teenagers, to really learn and develop to becoming the most effective human beings that they can be. And I left teaching. I went back. I joined a research organizations which studied the way structures and roles are used to help people to learn and develop. And I've spent the rest of my working life doing that.
So it's fair to say that education has basically played a part throughout your whole life.
Learning.
Mm-hmm.
Education always sounds as though it's terribly organized, whereas we learn an enormous amount. We learn all the time.
Yeah, that's
but
true.
We don't necessarily know what we're learning.
Yes.
So you pick up a lot of bad habits on the way.
I've picked up no bad habits from you. I've learned a lot from you, but not a single bad habit.
I don't believe it.
So let's go right back to the start.
Yeah.
From your education in India, Venezuela, and in England, and what am I missing a country there?
No, that's the right country.
No, there was nowhere in Iran or
no.
Okay, so out of all these places, was there a teacher that you remember that inspired you or made a big impact on you that you remember?
I think yes. I think I'd put it like this: it was the heads of the schools themselves who were the people I found I was really taking my guidance from, because they were the people who I could see from very early on were the people who really influenced what the whole school was about. And if I could understand the unavoidable connection that one had as a pupil, a student in a school, with the principal or the head teacher, you could then begin to think about how you would begin to work in a working organization as a grown-up, because you would focus your attention on what the leadership of the organization was trying to do.
It's quite interesting because I think that most students, me included, when you're at school, you kind of think of the head teacher as quite separate from you, and you don't really have any direct connection with them, and it's the people in the classroom with you that directly impact you. But you were thinking more about how the organization of the school worked and how it's shaped by the person.
That's right, and therefore
at the top,
it was the link between the teacher in the classroom and the whole of the school.
Right.
And I remember doing some work when I was doing my research and consultancy, doing some work in a school in North London where I was observing what was happening in the classroom. And there was one young man who was getting more and more upset and angry with the teacher. And the teacher was incompetent, making a complete mess of things. And this boy got up, and I could see him advancing towards the teacher as if to hit him. And suddenly you could see there's something switched inside his head. He could see that if I hit this guy, I'm going to have to deal with that other guy at the top of the tree. And he went back and sat down.
Right, okay. So the fear, the kind of the aura of the head teacher was enough to control
That's
the
right.
school.
And because in those days, you had assembly every day, you would always see the head of the school at the beginning of every day.
Right.
Up there.
Okay. So they had a big kind of
they have an unconscious effect.
Right. And so when you and is there anyone specific? Is there any kind of person that you remember really
the person who I think probably was most important to me was the headmaster of Tunbridge, because there was I'd come from 2 schools in India and 2 schools in South America. And my time in South America, I was in Spanish-speaking schools.
Right.
So whenever I spent my time in a classroom, I would be sitting thinking in Spanish. And when I got back to England, I would be daydreaming and speaking whatever I was going to in my head, and suddenly get asked a question by a teacher, and I would reply in Spanish. And they thought I was just mucking about.
¿Y todavía sabes hablar español?
Sí, un poco.
Un poco. It was, to put it into context for people who don't know you, because you look very young. So you would have been thinking and speaking in Spanish about 80 years ago.
Yeah.
80 years ago. But you still remember.
Sí.
Puedes hablar si quieres.
Recuerdo mucho.
Recuerdas mucho de tu tiempo en Venezuela.
Sí.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Y cuando piensas de Venezuela, ¿qué piensas de tus recuerdos?
The school, I was at the Colegio San Ignacio in the middle of Caracas, which was run by Jesuits. And I was very impressed by their self-discipline, their openness, and the freedom with which they treated me. But what was more important while I was in Venezuela was I joined the Scouts.
Yeah.
And the Boy Scouts were the addition to the emergency services. So if there was a flood in one of the barrios, then the Scouts would go there to support the ambulance and the police and the firefighters.
Okay. So you're playing an active part in the community.
Absolutely. And when the police went on strike one day, the Boy Scouts were mobilized to manage all the traffic junctions. And me, aged 12 years old, wearing my short trousers and my funny hat, stood on a big box about 4 feet high and directed the traffic.
It's funny to think about you as a young boy directing traffic in Caracas, in Venezuela.
Yeah, exactly.
So one more thing before we move on from your childhood is, so you spent time in 3 different education systems.
Yeah.
India, Venezuela, and England.
Yeah.
Did you notice noticeable differences between how education was run, how teachers and students related to each other in these 3 places? I mean, India, you were quite young.
In India, I was in Indian schools, or schools in India, until I was 10.
Okay, so can you still remember these?
Oh, I can remember. I remember because the second school I was at in India was again a Jesuit school. And I can remember the kindness and the generosity of the chaplain, because when I was going to leave to come back to England, he tried very hard to get me to sign up as a Roman Catholic, because I'm an Anglican.
Yeah.
And I remember him trying to give me a rosary, but the way in which he did it was as if to say, look, here's a choice for you, and if you can make whatever choice you and I will respect you. And that man respected the 10-year-old's choice to reject the kind of Christian that the chaplain was. And I thought,
is that something that was specific to India that you feel that?
no, I think it was specific to that school.
Okay.
Because yes, he was an Indian, but
he was more of an open-minded.
Yes, exactly.
Okay, and so and then when you went to Venezuela, did you notice a difference in the relationship between the teachers and students?
Well, the first school I was at was Colegio Americano in Bellomonte, which was a Baptist American school. I hadn't a clue who was running that. Right. I was in my class with Profe. I didn't speak Spanish.
So it was quite a confusing time.
It was and I found that the way to survive in the classroom was to make everybody else laugh. And I was very good at that.
Something you must have lost over the years.
Yes.
What happened to that skill?
In the end, my father was summoned to, and he didn't speak Spanish very well either. But I remember my father saying to Profe, what you must do is to make him run around the playing fields, to get him tired, and then he won't give you any trouble.
Wow. So, and did it work?
Sorry?
Did it work?
No. But I did learn enough Spanish to be able to understand what he was trying to do.
So you learned through necessity.
Absolutely.
Okay, so you had a bit of a chaotic education system, moving from school to school. You went to 6 different schools. Then you became a teacher.
Yeah.
When you became a teacher, what did you have a philosophy about what kind of teacher you wanted to be?
Well, I always wanted to not just teach my subject, but to be able to help the people I was working with to grow up and become more mature as human beings. So I wanted them to understand, because I'd read philosophy, politics, and economics at university, and I was teaching politics and economics, but that only filled up 5 periods of my weekly timetable, which had 35 lessons I had to teach.
Right.
So the headmaster, when he appointed me, said, could you teach a bit of history? So I said yes. So I had a couple of classes that I taught history to. Could you teach general studies in the 6th form to help them to understand the world? Yes, I'd love to do that. Well, that leaves us with 17 other periods. Would you be prepared to teach 1 or 2 lessons of religious instruction? Okay. I said 1 or 2 periods a week would be good for my soul.
Right.
And when I got my first timetable, I had 17 periods, once a week, with 17 periods, with 17 different. I taught nearly a quarter of the school.
Right. So you were the one person who said yes to religious instruction.
Exactly. How stupid can you be?
But did you enjoy it, or was it?
Well, it was exhausting.
Right.
Because I had to prepare every single one of those lessons. I then had to go into a class for 45 minutes. And because it was a comprehensive school, I could be teaching semi-literate 12-year-olds, and then be teaching people in the 6th form going to go to university.
Right.
So the mental gymnastics I was having
quite difficult.
Well, it was exciting. It was challenging because I had to find things inside myself. Because to begin with, all I was bothered about was trying to control them. So long as I could shout as loud as possible, then I hoped that would work. But then I began to realize that shouting loud wasn't enough. So I invited the headmaster to come and sit at the back of my classes for 3 or 4 lessons to do 2 things. One, demonstrated that if they caused me trouble, they'd be in trouble with him. Yeah. And the other thing was that he could then say, well, look, John, or Mr. Bazalgette, that you did this. Well, really, that wasn't a very sensible thing to do. And you spoke like this to that person. And he gave me my sort of first training in being a teacher.
Very nice. Very nice. And so you were a teacher for how many? You were a teacher for how many years?
For 5 years.
For 5 years. And then where did you?
Well, I realised that actually, I really didn't deserve to be paid as a teacher because I hadn't been trained as one.
Okay.
So I was able to negotiate to go back to university to study for an advanced diploma in education, which would now be called a master's. There I studied psychology, child development, philosophy of education, history of education, statistics, and so on. So I began to learn all the disciplines, which in fact back up at a teacher. But in the middle of that time, I had been involved with an organisation which was then called Christian Teamwork, which became the Grubb Institute, where the thinking that organisation were doing was to say, if you're going to have a religious faith,
right,
it needs to fit with your process of growing up as a human being and understand how human organizations and groups function. And I'd been on a couple of short courses and one or two discussions. And I then went, in the middle of my time back at Exeter University, I went on a week's full-time residential course run by the Tavistock Institute, which is one of the big organizations in psychoanalysis and so on, and Christian Teamwork. And that brought together the psychological understanding with the idea about faith. So I wrote to the director of Christian Teamwork, as they were called, and said, give me a job.
Yeah.
And he didn't answer. He didn't answer for about 6 weeks, and I was beginning to come towards.
So I presume you gave up then?
No, I did not. I was beginning to begin to look. I started applying for jobs as a senior teacher, deputy head of the sixth form, that kind of thing. But I wanted to go and do the job. So we got together and we devised a research project, an action research project, which was the applications for money were going in different places, one of which was the English government, the Department of Education and Science, as it was. But we got to the end of my time at university, and though Christian Teamwork were ready to give me a job, no money was available.
Right.
So I started work on the 1st of September for Christian Teamwork with 3 children and a 4th on the way, no house, and no guarantee of a job. Now, I'd said to Bruce Reed, the director of Christian Teamwork, I could work with you for 1 term or 3 months without being paid because I've got enough savings.
Okay.
So I started, and I didn't know whether I was going to have to pull on my savings, but I went out the first day to look for a house, and I found a house for us to live in on the first day, almost the first place I looked at.
Yeah, this is for people watching it. It's not like today where back in those days you could just go out, find a house, and
yeah, that's true.
Put down a couple of quid, and
well, it was and on the 15th of September, so a fortnight after I started work, the grant for the research project came in.
Right. So that was just everything kind of fell into place.
Everything fell into place.
And this is because during your time teaching that you kind of found a passion for education.
For learning, particularly about learning as a human being.
And the Grubb Institute was kind of examining how that could be done
exactly
in a better way.
In a better way, yes, and particularly in terms of the way the Christian teaching helps one to be a fuller and more effective person.
Right.
So it's not about learning to be obedient and saying, yes or no, so 3 bags full, so God bless me, and forgive me all my sins. None of that.
No. It was a bit cooler than that.
It was cooler than that. But, I was tested because one of the job was to help the way in which teenagers, inner city teenagers, could learn to really understand how to manage their lives. And the Christian Teamwork had got access to a building which we could make available to the teenagers in Islington, where they could play snooker, play ping pong, play music,
like a kind of youth
club. It was a youth club. It was a youth club. But we were going to say, look, if I could find a gang that lived and was influencing the area, I could say, look, do you want to learn something about the grown-up world? because we've got a place where you can have the building.
Yeah.
We can give some conditions, but we'll let you run it, and we'll mean that your gang leader, he's really the youth leader.
Mm-hmm.
But I and my 2 or 3 colleagues are supporters to help you.
Right.
You're going to have to form a committee. You're going to have to learn how to manage the boundaries,
Mm-hmm.
how you let people in, how much you're going to charge them, all that.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's what they did. Now, it so happens that a few years into my time there, I discovered that the place I was trying to recruit a gang to run the club had the
was it an actual gang?
It was an actual gang. It was that part of London had the highest murder rate in Europe.
Wow. Yes, and there was you right in the middle, trying to recruit them to run.
That's
a
right.
youth club.
In fact, well, I had got one of them, and the word had gone out.
Right.
And Renzo Giardella, who was the gang leader, he was the chairman. He and I were standing at the door. The people come to the table, give their names, pay their tuppence or whatever it was, and then going upstairs. And all of a sudden, a little bunch, 3 or 4 guys came in. Mm-hmm. Renzo looked at them as they came, and as they were trying to sign in, he reached into his pocket, pulled out a hammer, and hit one in the face.
It wasn't the most inviting.
Exactly. Well, anyhow, very sensibly, those guys, they were from another gang.
They were from a different gang. Different youth club.
So they turned around and went running down the passageway out. Now the door outside opened up, which I was meant to. So I knew we've got to get out there and got to get that door shut so they can't come back in again with more. So I went out, was bending down, unhitching the thing, when Renzo and his mates came in and grabbed the door, pulled the door shut with me on the outside.
Oh no! So you were stuck out with the other gang.
And they in those days there were milk bottles and so on all done. So I was there as a hail of milk bottles. Not one of them actually.
Oh, they were throwing them at me.
They were throwing them at me.
So who knows? You start life in education. You don't know where it's going to take you.
Absolutely.
And that is, you never know the stories you're going to get. If you survive.
That's right. Yeah. But then I was able to get a bit more sort of disciplined. I started working with groups from schools, from employment, from being on probation, and so on, and helping them to explore, to meet people who are in positions of authority, and they started to meet police, obviously, prison officers, head teachers, the local manager of the local semi-professional football club, and a whole lot of other people. And they would be absolutely riveted as they talk to people in positions of power and authority about what it's like.
So, I mean, I'm going to go back to when you were talking about how the headmaster was the most important person for you.
That's right.
And then later on in your career, you're trying to connect people who are a little bit lost with people in positions of power.
That's right.
So you obviously think that the people in power connecting with people who are not in power is an incredibly important part of...
Absolutely. It's central, it's key.
Yes.
The bright, clever ones...
Forming young...
The bright, clever ones will make their way anyhow.
Right.
It's the other ones. It's the ones who are semi-literate, or their families are very poor, or they've got a lot of family history of illness and so on.
Yeah.
So it's how can the way people who run the organisations actually know what's happening down there, rather than thinking, if I can do things nice and strictly and firmly, lots of clear rules and uniform and so on and so forth, then everybody will be obedient. So there's no trouble. A perfect school is one where everybody walks around like little soldiers.
And you think it should be much more fluid?
Yeah, absolutely.
So the education system as it is today, what are the main problems?
Well, I think the main problem is it was difficult enough and fragmented enough in 1967, 1960s.
Yeah.
Now, the fragmentation of all the services for working with young people is just out of this world. There's virtually no organisation where young people are sort of leaving their, going from being in their families, where they can begin to understand how it is to take part in a disciplined, organised adult life. The structures which were there 50, 60 years ago they're not there. It's all fragmented.
Right.
So the skills, then are, what are the skills and where can young people get them so that they can not just survive, but they can learn how to belong to something bigger than themselves.
Right. And how can that be changed on a large enough scale? What needs to change? Is it government? Is it?
Well, I think the whole idea about what education is for. Why educate people?
Right. Why?
Well, the idea of education is the words mean drawing out of. Educo is the Latin, to draw out. So how do you create the settings which are secure enough and stable enough for the young people who are in them, and the people who run them as teachers and leaders and so on can actually work with what comes out of the person, the young people.
Yeah.
So, there was people who I taught. There was one girl who I taught that all the time I was teaching. I had the same class right the way for 4 years. One girl who I taught in that class, the careers guidance person said, "Oh, you're just the kind of girl who ought to be a milkmaid."
Right. Not great encouragement.
Anyway, as a result of what she learnt from the time being in the class, she finished up by being the head teacher of a primary school.
So I think there's kind of a common theme that teachers get a lot of this stuff wrong when they predict students. They basically think someone who doesn't fall in line is not going to be successful.
That's right. But that's the way the culture is. We're a very infantile society now. We don't really trust grown-ups unless they're exactly the same as us.
Right.
Or they're not going to challenge the edges of us.
Yeah. And that's what leads to a lot of political and
that's right.
global situations.
There are those people who are clever enough and who want to fit in will always learn to fit in. No, you've learned it.
Yes.
But not by being a conventional on the way up. Now I say to myself, where did Frank learn to have that kind of career path that he's working? I think he might have learned it in the family.
Possibly.
Yes. Well, where else?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
So that's so basically you think that the education system is a little bit too rigid, that it's kind of more about giving knowledge to people than trying to get them to think for themselves.
That's right. And that was fine 100 years ago, 200,000 years ago, where on the whole, society wasn't changing.
Right.
It didn't change very fast. So the people at the top knew how they got there, so they could pass on the skills and the knowledge to follow to be like them.
Right.
But when you get the kind of world that you've got at the moment, with all this interaction, or internet interaction and communicate, and you don't know where the messages come from, and you don't know where your messages go, all that requires a new kind of skill.
You have to be much more, you have to think for yourself a lot more.
Yes, and you have to look up how
you can't just trust everything.
No, that's right. But you don't just think for yourself. You have to be able to, in a sense, evolve a working map of the world which you are going to live in.
Right.
That's what I've watched you doing over the last 3 or 4 years. So you've been able to devise a working map by doing things and say, oh God, that didn't work.
Exactly. So you can't really listen to everything. You've just got to go out there and do it for yourself and see.
Well, yes. If your view of the world is so different from everybody else's.
Right.
And particularly the people in positions of power. That's why one of the people is, unless you have relevant experience, it's very difficult to get a job.
Yeah.
Because if you've got experience, you're not going to cause awkward questions to the people in positions of power. Why did I do that? Because I myself, from the age of 5, was having to negotiate my way to learn how to belong in a whole series of different settings,
Yes.
which were so different
Well, that's exactly right. So your education, moving from school, country to country, language to language, that's obviously helped you a lot in being able to find your path through life.
That's right.
Because you're used to adapting.
That's right. I'm still adapting.
And a lot of people who go through the same education system doing what they're told are not going to be so comfortable adapting to new situations. And now the world is changing so quickly that being able to adapt is really the most important
Well,
thing.
it is, except for those people who have sufficient power, and by that I mean money and ownership of big companies. Those are the ones, the reason why Trump has surrounded himself with the same kind of people is because people are looking for, who are the people who've succeeded? How do I get on their tails?
Just blindly following.
And blindly follow. So even though somebody like the President of the United States is a certified criminal, is an adulterer, it cannot be trusted because he doesn't know his own mind. He changed his mind, with the change of the wind. But look, he's got there.
He's got money. So he must know what he's doing.
And he must know what he's doing. So if I can get close to him and follow him, and he'll pat me on my head for being a good boy, then that's the way I'm going to be able to make my life.
Right.
But it ain't going to work. It's not going to work. Because at the worst, it'll lead to the situation where he will come up against somebody else thinking the same way.
And neither will budge. And
then we'll have a war.
Right.
And he knows that.
Yes.
He knows that.
Okay, I would love to get more into this, but I have to keep it relevant.
Okay, yes.
So, just on a final note, if you look back on your career, the whole life and just in the parts that are connected to education, is there something that you are most proud of in terms of your achievements, or someone that you've helped, or a student that you?
Well, I suppose I can get one example. One of the things that I did when I was at Ashley's, the school where I was teaching, I looked at what they were doing in the sixth form, and they were all there with their noses down, working for their A-levels. And I thought, these youngsters need to be open, have their life opened up. So I started a sixth form play reading society, which meant monthly in people's homes. And one of the students would select a play, and I would get copies from the local library, and they would distribute them. The person who'd chosen the play would cast the actors, and then at the end, that one person had to write a review of the play and the writing and so on. The most promising science student in the school changed his subject from physics and so on to doing English and history.
I bet his parents wanted to kill you.
Well, the fact was he was one of the first people from that school to get to Oxford.
So there you go. So that is a big success story.
And he's now a published author. He's written about 5 or 6 different books, and we're still in touch with him.
You're still in touch with him?
Yeah.
Oh, that's amazing. And so when you look back, that's an example of someone that you can say that you're really proud of the effect that you had on his life. You changed the course of his life for education.
Yeah. And there was one other scientist who actually wrote a full-length play for the sixth form play reading society to read.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Well, and was it good?
Yeah, that was all right.
All right. Well, let's end it there. Thank you so much for.
That's just my teach. Those are people I'm proud of in my teaching.
Of course. Well, that's what we're asking about today. That's amazing. Thank you so much for sharing all of that insight and about education spanning. Not many people have an education spanning 3 continents and 90 years. So that's right. It's invaluable information.
Yes, and what it's based on is realizing that if I can understand the experience I'm having, my experience is always trying to teach me something.
Right. So you're always learning.
Always learning.
Always learning. So there's one message.
And learning to belong. Because you used to be able to belong in one place. You belong in your family and in your village. That
but
doesn't.
now you're in the global society.
Exactly. So we have to learn how to belong to things which are bigger and bigger and bigger. And one or two people like Nelson Mandela and Mahatma Gandhi had a feeling of belonging to the whole of humankind.
Mm-hmm.
And they knew how to behave and how to offer understanding of doing that. But we've got very few people who can think at that level now.
So let's end on that note.
Yeah.
Never stop learning.
Absolutely.
And
learning how to belong.
Never stop learning how to belong.
Yeah.
And if you like this podcast, if you enjoyed this conversation, then like and subscribe. And if you want to send a final message to anyone watching,
well, best of luck to you. If you can find the learning to belong is to learning what are the bits of yourself which you've not yet met.